So we're going to start off with some questions from Norshin and myself, just reflecting on the really interesting and sort of thought-provoking presentations we've just heard. And then after that, we'll get into the open questions, and we've been taking all of the questions sent in the chat box. There's still a chance to do that now. So we'll take 10 minutes now, or just under 10 minutes. So we'll pose a question to each of the speakers. And if it's possible to answer in less than 3 minutes, that would be awesome, although some of these questions are quite complex. So the first question is for Farhana. So this is quite a broad question, so forgive me if the framing is a bit waffly. But as someone who was from the research background, and now I'm working a lot in the kind of policy influencing space, especially around the gender climate nexus, I wanted to know what your thoughts were on what we need to create that space for the critical intersectional investigation that you rightly pointed out is just so important to developing any kind of relevant and sustainable policy responses. So there are sort of two parts to that broader question. One is, from your experience and observations, do you think there are patriarchal dynamics there in terms of getting more intersectional work across, specifically in the kind of urban Bangladesh context? The reason I'm asking that is because I note, being located outside of Bangladesh, that it's often put forward as the golden child by international donors, and there are a lot of kind of well-known male speakers. That doesn't mean there aren't lots of fantastic female experts, but I note that it's the sort of male speakers that often get given the platform on adaptation. So what are the realities for women from different backgrounds in influencing thinking around adaptation? And secondly, even if that space is there for different women's kind of intervention, what is there sufficient funding and space for researchers to do that critical intersectional work that you were talking about? And just, you're still on mute, I think.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I was just writing it down and I forgot to unmute myself. I was writing down the question. So my question was, do you want me to respond to your question, or do you want me to wait to collect all your questions and then respond in one go?
If you respond to this one, that would be awesome, given that it's quite complex. So.
All right. Okay. So I'll see if I can address it on the fly. So basically, my sense of what you asked is, like, how do we create space for these intersectional research to make it into policy and practice, like this overarching, and underneath that was that were there patriarchal dynamics in getting the work across? Yes, absolutely. Because patriarchy is not located only in the communities, right? It's definitely located within donor institutions, NGOs, and policymaking. Who gets to have a voice? Whose voice is heard? It's not just having both voice, it's being heard and then being taken seriously enough and then follow through. So it's that kind of inclusivity that's often missing in policymaking and practice, although it's been changed. And yes, Bangladesh is often held up as the golden child of how to do better gender research, because yes, a lot has happened. It's a country where there's a lot of progressive research happening. It has become the kind of crucible of climate adaptation research for about 30 years. I mean, I've been involved in climate work since I was in college. That was a long time back. And I know a lot of the people who are all the way up to the UN IPCC level, scientists and negotiators, who I've known since I was a child, in terms of who've been very vocal about issues around climate change when it was not popular, and continue to remain influential. At the same time, they're all men, almost always. So there is that, access to education, to voice, to power, to authority, which I think are socialized, because gender is ultimately a power relation, right? And patriarchy is kind of practiced in subtle and overt ways in the way we live our lives and how we compose our society. So that is one quick, the quick on the fly response to that. So there are some barriers, but it doesn't mean that these elderly men who are in these positions of power are not feminists. Many are. So it's not necessarily your identity or subjectivity, but it's about your politics. So if you're, so that's part of it. At the same time, there's something called politics of representation. You still have to be inclusive of different kinds of voices and different kinds of genders, whether it's men, women, and transgender, which is quite large in South Asia. So then, when we think about these kinds of barriers to who gets to participate, whose voice counts. And we see that all the way down from community level, neighborhood level, slum or informal settlement level, organizational structures, all the way up to global governance structures. And I think this is what are some of the issues that feminist scholars have talked about. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to speak really fast and I talk really fast, so I apologize. You may need to rehear the recording. But I realize that to be mindful of time. And your second question, if I heard it correctly, was about funding for research or funding for policy.
Is there sufficient funding and space for scholars to be doing that research that, because we know, yeah.
That's my gut instinct. I mean, that's based on my experience. Could there be in other countries? I don't know, possibly. There is increasing, but I have to qualify that statement. If you look back historically through funding budgeting, right? You didn't have gender budgeting 30 years ago the way you do now. So, I'll qualify that, yes, it's improving in the right direction, but it's not moving fast enough and it's not really accounting for everything. And at the same time, there's this global north, global south dynamics, that a lot of funding that's allocated, comes from the global north and is siphoned right back to the global north scholars, to global north, nonprofits, NGOs. So how much is actually capacity building on the ground or supporting scholars and activists and workers in the communities that are being researched, right? Because there's something that a lot of, as a geographer and as a feminist political ecologist, we talk about this quite a lot in terms of that we have to deploy proper research ethics. And we're not necessarily seeing a lot of feminist ethics weaving into the kind of work that's done, because it's often seen as local climate is happening and development is happening. And these are all these normative, technocratic things that are rendered apolitical when they're entirely political. And so I think we need more funding. Is there more funding coming in? Possibly, but it depends on where it's being allocated, who has access to it, and how it's being used. So I think it's better now than it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago. But I'm not entirely sure it's actually making it down to the grassroots level where it really should.
Thank you. I think Nosheen has a question now for Nicola.
Thank you, Amira. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some comments out there, and then I'm not going to pose my question because we are running out of time, and we really would like our audience, who has posed quite a number of questions, I'd like to get these questions into our discussion also. And these questions are for all our 3 speakers. So I'm going to start highlighting some of them. But I would like to tell the audience, to tell our participants, that I won't be able to highlight everyone's question because we simply don't have enough time. But the comment that I want to make is that in listening to the 3 participants, their wonderful presentations, and there's so much to learn from what all 3 of you have shared. The complexity of this particular issue that the CCUVN project tries to address is that how can we think about the linkages and identify the linkages between violence and climate change, or urban violence and climate change. And from these 3 presentations, a couple of things become particularly apparent in terms of the challenges ahead of us. First of all, that these challenges are scalar, essentially. And by scalar, I mean that we're not only talking about the level of the city, we are looking at the sub-regional and the regional level. And for instance, in Imran's talk, we are getting beyond the metropolis now. We aren't simply talking about Karachi, we're talking about the small towns and the medium towns, the areas that are usually beyond our, our immediate sense, our gaze, our engagement. Places like Dera Ghazi Khan and Dera Ghazi and Chang, which don't always compute on a regular basis because our attention on climate change is largely always about the metropolis or city centers, etc. So within this challenge of thinking about urban violence and its different permutations, as Nicola has so nicely brought to the forefront, especially the issue of structural violence, which I think we cannot forget as we talk about pandemics and we talk about climate change issues. But the scalar dynamic is very important. Secondly, the issue of managing risk. Risk collateral, right? That people can be a kind of a risk collateral, as Imran tells us, and this risk collateral in turn is shot through with these gender dynamics also, which are incredibly, perverse. And finally, that the colonial aspect that rings true even to this day, the colonial present, when Nicola talks about, Nicola, you talked about imperial air as murderous, and there is something about that lingers even today. And then perhaps finally that climate change cannot be seen by any means as a technocratic problem that can be resolved by bureaucrats or engineers or sitting at the helm of very centralized forms of governance, which is essentially what we see across South Asia. So, definitely in Pakistan, and if I'm not wrong, perhaps also to some extent in India and Bangladesh as well. So how do we get beyond, so the decision-making aspect, how do we encourage community participation? Where are these interventions where we can bring communities on board in discussions? This becomes, I think, a particularly important question. So just keeping these things in mind, I have from our audience a question for Farhana. And this is from Sabah Aslam, who happens to be a master's student over at IDS at Sussex. And I know because Sabah and I have communicated on other occasions. So Sabah is asking you, Farhana, that are there any patterns of water inequalities with respect to ethnic, caste, or religious differences in the city? And then alongside that, and the question, this is the second part of that question that she poses, are there any organizations, mobilizations, forms of collective action where women can come together or have come together to make demands to urban authorities to address the gendered inequalities in terms of access to water supply that they face? So Farhana, if you address this, then I will go to Nicola and to Imran with one question each.
Sure. So thanks for the question. So in terms of ethnic, class, and religious, right? So class definitely, which I'd mentioned, because that is the largest signifier of difference and oppression often in these post-colonial cities in terms of who has privilege, who doesn't. And this is often mapped out spatially that I was talking about in terms of middle class and wealthy homes who have water, and then informal settlements, which is 30 to 40% of the city that don't. So there's definitely these differences. Religious, not as much, because Bangladesh is a Muslim majority country. However, there's a significantly large minority population of Hindus and Christians. So there isn't a huge amount of religious differences in terms of water inequalities. From what I witnessed, except for amongst the Hindu population, because of caste differences in terms of caste understandings of who pollutes water, who can access what source of water, who can share water. But that's kind of more of a religiosity that's driving it. But it's still been tempered with a sense of urbanity and urbanness, what it means to be an urban citizen. Ethnic differences, not so much. Again, it's ethnically somewhat homogeneous. That is not to say there isn't a significant indigenous population that is different, but not in terms of water security, in terms of water access and water sharing. In terms of the second part of the question, and again, I'm answering these really quickly, so apologize for these not being rather lacking a lot of nuance. But in terms of organizations and mobilization, collective action, yes, absolutely. So the communities that I've worked with in informal settlements have mobilized and called for their human right to water to the public water municipality. As a result, through years and decades-long active kind of collective action, which is difficult when you're poor and you don't have land tenure and your huts are constantly being bulldozed, that some informal settlements or slums have been connected to the public water supply. However, majority of these small scattered slums throughout the city face exploitation and greater water insecurity from the private water vendors who charge exorbitant rates. At the same time, there's also NGO-supported initiatives to organize people to help secure water supplies. But again, going back to my response to the prior question that Amira had posed, in terms of the key issue is about representation, but who's speaking for whom and who has what kind of water. So for instance, even within the space of a slum, you have to do more granular research in figuring out like who has more social capital, and it's usually the recent migrants who don't. Recent arrivals from the countryside, from coastal areas, usually face more water insecurity because, even though they may be slum inhabitants, they're not the same level of, citizen of the city. So there's these kind of different scalar and cross-class differences, some cross-class alliances, but not a whole lot of cross-class alliance. But there is some mobilization organization amongst the poor, as well as with the NGO and donor support.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Farhana. Wonderfully answered. So I'm going to move on to Imran. So Imran, this is also from Sabah Aslam. Sorry, if I don't mean to take up Sabah Aslam's questions. I want to give others a chance also, but this is just coming up in front. So I'm just reaching out to these quickly. So Imran, Sabah is asking, how can women's inclusion in the communities that you've worked in Dera Ghazi and Jhang, and the relief efforts lead to more favorable outcomes for women, children, marginalized communities? What are the potential entry points for women to be included in these infrastructural regimes? So Imran, really quickly, 2 minutes, if possible.
Yeah, so women are already part of the decision-making apparatus at the household level, right? And if somebody's running a small business, they're also doing it out of their home, so they're already there as well. But it's just that the governmental setups do not address them. Just despite the fact that a lot of our policies talk about gender mainstreaming, and they mention a lot of these words in the way that development agencies might like, but it's not translating on the ground. So, by having women's participation at that level, when it comes to pre-flood events or post-disaster relief, we could have a holistic response to these issues. A lot of problems come up later on, and they could be averted by having that particular voice, because when their voice is missing, be it if you're talking about early warning system, be it in terms of placing of relief supplies, setting up of a relief camp, numerous other issues, then we could really have a response that caters to their needs. Unfortunately, that is not happening. It's just that what we're doing right now is we're essentially following the same plans and policies that have been in place for the past 40 years, for example, and that needs to change. I'm not really sure whether I've answered that or not.
No, very well answered. So again, we come back to the question of policy, which is, I think, that and the politics of climate change, which are co-constitutive, and how do you budge that? The policy question is, I think, the white elephant in the room that is the hardest one to deal with. So to Nicola. Nicola, a question from Fatma Yamin, who asks, how do you see the intersections of climate change, gender vulnerability, street domestic violence, etc., affect macro conflict places within Pakistan in areas like Northwest? By that, I presume she means Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, for instance. How deeply entrenched can these experiences be, and what aspects can we research or study in these settings?
Thank you so much. That's a difficult question on the hoof, and just building what others have said. I mean, I don't know. We're thinking through the answers to these, but I think there are things that we can do at multiple levels, as people have said. I'll just give you a small example from where I live in Brighton. The city is 1% the size of Karachi, which is just the city council's just set up a citizens' assembly for climate change. It's got representatives from, it's got a specialist advisory board, and it's got representatives from diverse communities as well as stakeholders, MPs, and the council, who the idea then is to discuss climate issues and their interaction with other kinds of exclusion, particularly to promote the idea that it's change needed on a systemic level, that we have to change all. We can't just change individual behavior around recycling or this kind of thing, but we have to, it's about systemic change. And the council's agreed to act on if there's an 80% agreement around a recommendation. They take different topics like waste, energy, transport, housing, and something else. But I don't know. I mean, I think we have to start local. We have to increase diversity on political and social community initiatives for change, and we somehow have to promote mechanisms for participatory democracy. I think both the other speakers said it's about increasing knowledge and thereby increasing political will. And on a bigger macro level, I think as Nosheen, you said, is much harder at that level, and we need a powerful expert activist. I mean, one thing, if we don't have them nationally or in our local context, I mean, we do live in a global world, and there are some very influential, brilliant women around. I was just thinking of Farhana Yamin, who is an environmental lawyer. She's a development policy expert, Extinction Rebellion activist. She's worked on Paris Climate Agreement, on the IPCC. You know, and has advised leaders in different countries. And I think we need to do a lot of profile raising around figures such as her, who are firmly embedded within the policy world. But also, if you think about people like Greta Thunberg, who is a school kid, and how she and her actions of being outside of that world were able to propel such a massive force for change and increase awareness. So I know I haven't addressed your specific questions about KP, but I don't think I'm able to actually right now. So apologies for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. No, very well put, and I hope that for Fatma, who posed this question, that at least it opens a window into thinking about these issues from yet another vantage point. So, so there was another question that is posed, and this will be my last one, to all three speakers. This is from Mariam Siddiqui, who asks that, considering, and you, either one of you or all of you in your own ways can answer this, and this is a very quick question, so the response might also be fairly quick, hopefully. Considering the numerous stakeholders in climate-related policies and the diversity amongst the population, is it even possible to make research and interventions community-specific? Yeah, so whoever wants to jump into that.
I can just speak really quickly, because this is something that I have to teach about when I teach about international development. Like, how do you create spaces for difference? How do you create spaces for different voices? So yes, you can have, if I understood the question, that the intervention needs to be at the community level, but you still can account for that granular specificity that I was alluding to earlier in my talk, in terms of heeding and capturing different voices and concerns, and then addressing them with equity and justice in mind. So the question is, what is the kind of the directive that's driving these kinds of interventions? So first is like, how do you account for these voices? That is where the research ethics and participatory research collectives matter. But at the same time, then how do you take those voices and account for whatever intervention you're designing? So you may not get to make everybody happy, but you make more people happy than just the majority, which is then, winner takes all, which is not entirely fair to the people who are not part of the winning group. So you try to make it as more equitable as possible. But again, I think that is often depending on, your kind of epistemological positioning, and then also your methodological training and how you approach that kind of research, and then how do you design it and plan it and implement it. And even after you implement it, it can fall apart. So there has to be accountability, feedback loops and mechanisms. So it's about that kind of transparency and accountability that is often missing, because there's so much lip service that happens. And I think this is where that kind of intersectional feminist lens becomes important, because of the things you learn in terms of research ethics and methods and ethics of care and all of the things that come with it. I mean, part of the reason why I'm no longer a climate scientist is because I learned all this and I decided to switch paths. I'll leave it at that.
Matan, you take up that question?
Yeah, just very briefly. Yeah, I agree, and I think also that there's a good point to make. I think Imran raised it, that no matter how hard we try and whatever best efforts we can and ideas we can come up with, we do have to acknowledge the obstacles that are there because of the massive vested interests of governments and big business in oil, energy, fossil fuel projects. Fossil fuel projects. So yeah, we're up. It's a tough fight.
Imran, would you like to add something?
Yeah, no, I agree with what's already been said. I think it's, just, so there are two things there. One is paying lip service. So as I looked at the climate change policy, and I thought that, let me see how much of what is it saying about gender? I mean, this came about in 2012. The current government has said that, well, that's, they're trying to review it. They don't think that it's going to work. So every time a new government comes in, they're going to come up with a policy. So it has a fairly good section on gender. I mean, it's very textbookish. It's there. I think if I was grading a project I'd probably give it 100 out of 100. But is that translating on the ground? Is that based on what's happening in Sindh? Is that based on what's happening in southern Punjab? Is that based on what's happening in northern areas where there's glacial melt happening? So research is very important, and then engaging with the populations, engaging with the communities. That needs to happen not only when we talk about the researchers, but also when we talk about the governmental department. So if the ministry is doing something, I just saw an ad whereby whatever we've got in our minds, but the communities come in at the very end, if at all, and that needs to change. And unless and until we start to bring the communities on board right from the get-go, and have mechanisms in place whereby we can evaluate these projects from this point of view, we'll keep facing these problems, and 10, 20, 30 years down the road, we'll still be talking about this, because that's what's left.
Yeah, 10, 20, 30 years from now, my goodness, we don't want to imagine what the situation is going to be like in South Asia vis-a-vis the impacts of climate change. So I'm going to now bring this session to an end. I just want to highlight Amira's point in the chat forum. She says, I was going to say to everyone that this profiling of women experts is so very important. I have even been asked by the COP26 unit to do this. So please do send me names of women that you feel should be platformed. So hear her call, please, and do share what you have with Amira. So I want to thank our wonderful speakers, Farhana Sultana, Nicola Khan, Imran Khalid. If you want to know more about their individual works, we have been tweeting all morning about Farhana's work. You can find Dr. Farhana Sultana's public profile on Twitter, and we've tweeted a link to her work. We have done so for Dr. Nicola Khan also, who's done absolutely amazing work on Karachi and now continues to expand into climate change projects. Hopefully, Nicola and our collaborations will work out. We have interesting stories of a project involved with HEC and what the Higher Education Commission of Pakistan, those experiences.
Yeah, too long to tell. Yeah.
Too long to tell. And Imran, thank you for your excellent knowledge sharing about Dera Ghazi and Shang. So thank you all, and thank you, our wonderful audience, for your excellent questions. And I apologize to everyone if I wasn't able to showcase everyone's question. It's a question of time. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all.